Before the first body is found, I have to give you a fair warning. What you're about to hear today isn't just true crime, it is a descent to evil. These 6 stories represent the absolute extremes of human nature. They are disturbing, they are calculated, and frankly, they get progressively harder to stomach as we go deeper into the list. And before we get into the first story, drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you in bed with your lights off? Or are you on a lonely road somewhere? Let us know, we're reading. And now, let's get into it. There's a photograph that has haunted investigators, journalists, and criminologists for nearly 5 decades. In it, a large man in a white clown costume stands grinning next to a woman who is smiling back at him. He is wearing face paint. He goes by Pogo the Clown at parties and fundraisers and children's events. He is charming, he is generous, he is one of the most respected men in his neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. He has shaken hands with the First Lady of the United States. His name is John Wayne Gacy, and buried beneath the floorboards of his house, beneath the very house where this photograph was almost certainly taken, are the decomposing remains of 26 young men. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what John Wayne Gacy looked like from the outside, because from the outside, he was a success story. He was a self-made contractor, a small business owner, a man who threw elaborate parties for his neighbors and dressed as a clown to entertain sick children at hospitals. He was active in the local Democratic Party. He coached youth sports. He was the kind of man that other men on his street would describe, when the police came knocking, as a real stand-up guy. And they meant it. They were not lying to protect him. They genuinely believed it. That is the thing about John Wayne Gacy that is most difficult to sit with. The people around him were not fooled by a performance. The performance was so total, so seamless, so completely integrated into his daily life, that for years, there was no gap between the mask and what lay beneath it. Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942. His childhood was marked by a father who was emotionally cold and periodically violent, and who considered his son a failure, almost from the beginning. Gacy would later describe his relationship with his father as one of the central wounds of his life, a man trying endlessly to earn the approval of someone who was constitutionally incapable of giving it. He moved to Iowa as a young adult, married, had 2 children, ran a fried chicken franchise, and then in 1968 was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage employee. He served 18 months of a 10-year sentence, was paroled, and moved back to Illinois, where his first wife had already divorced him and taken the children. He rebuilt. That is the thing that needs to be said plainly. John Wayne Gacy rebuilt his life with extraordinary energy and discipline after a conviction for sexual assault against a child. He started a construction company. He remarried. He ingratiated himself into his community with a focused, methodical charm that in retrospect reads as deliberate, though it may simply have been who he was. By 1972, he was established, respected, and beginning to kill. His first confirmed victim was a young man named Timothy McCoy, 15 years old, who Gacy lured to his home in January of 1972 and stabbed to death. Gacy would later tell investigators, with a detachment that made the room go cold, that he had experienced an orgasm at the moment of the killing. He buried Timothy in the crawl space beneath his house and went back to work on Monday morning. Over the next 6 years, Gacy would murder at least 32 more young men and boys, most of them between the ages of 14 and 21. His method was consistent. He would target young men who were transient, who were runaways, who worked in construction and needed cash, or who frequented the Greyhound bus terminal near Bughouse Square, a known gathering place for homeless youth. He would offer them work, or money, or simply a place to sleep. He would bring them back to West Somerdale Avenue, and they would not leave. He killed them in a variety of ways: strangulation, suffocation, but his preferred method, the one he used most consistently, involved a piece of rope and a technique he called the rope trick, which he would demonstrate to victims as though it were a game before using it to take their lives. The degree of premeditation in this, the construction of what amounted to a rehearsed method of execution, is one of the many details of this case that investigators found almost impossible to process. He buried most of his victims in the crawl space. When that filled up, he began burying them in other parts of the property. When the property ran out of space, he began dumping bodies into the Des Plaines River. 5 victims were recovered from the river. The rest were found at the house. The investigation that would eventually bring Gacy down began not with any of his victims, but with a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest, who disappeared from a pharmacy in Des Plaines in December of 1978. Piest had told his mother he was going to speak to a contractor about a summer job and would be right back. He was never right back. The contractor's name was Gacy. A detective named Joseph Kozenzak, who would later write a book about the case, requested a search warrant for Gacy's property. The first time officers entered the house, they smelled something. Gacy explained it was a sump pump problem. They found nothing on that first visit. On the second visit, they found everything. The crawl space beneath West Somerdale Avenue contained the remains of 26 people. The smell had been present for months. The neighbors had noticed it. Gacy had explained it away as plumbing, as a drainage issue, as the normal smell of an older house in winter. Some of his neighbors had believed him, some had privately wondered, but not asked. That is the particular horror at the community level of a case like this. The willingness of ordinary people to accept an ordinary explanation when the alternative is too enormous to consider. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978. He confessed almost immediately. He told investigators about each victim with a clinical precision that deeply disturbed even the most experienced officers in the room. He remembered details. He remembered some names. He was matter-of-fact in a way that one detective later described as the absence of something human. Of the 33 victims ultimately attributed to him, 9 were never identified during his lifetime. Advances in DNA technology have since identified several more, but as of this recording, at least 5 remain unknown. At trial, Gacy's defense argued insanity. 12 psychiatrists testified. The jury deliberated for 2 hours before convicting him on all 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row, during which time he painted prolifically, obsessively, primarily self-portraits in his clown costume, and portraits of other famous killers. His paintings sold, people bought them, he gave interviews. He maintained, to the end, that he was innocent, or that other people had done the killings, or that his employees had used the crawl space without his knowledge. He changed his story repeatedly. What he never changed was his fundamental posture. He was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. His last meal was fried chicken, shrimp, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. His last words were, "Kiss my ass." In the room outside, the families of his victims waited to be told it was over. After the execution, Gacy's brain was removed and donated to a researcher who had studied the brains of other serial killers. The researcher found nothing anomalous, no tumor, no lesion, no visible physiological explanation. John Wayne Gacy's brain looked, under examination, like anyone else's brain. That may be the most disturbing finding of the entire case. In August of 1973, a 17-year-old boy named Elmer Wayne Henley picked up a gun inside a house in Pasadena, Texas, and shot the man who had been his friend, his employer, and the architect of the worst series of child murders in American history. He shot him 6 times. Then he called the police and said, in a voice that witnesses later described as completely flat, "I just killed a man." The man he had killed was Dean Arnold Corll. And what the police found when they responded to that call, and in the days and weeks and months that followed, was something so catastrophic in its scale and so monstrous in its nature that it shook the city of Houston to a foundation it has never fully rebuilt. Dean Corll was 33 years old when he died on that floor in Pasadena. He had been killing boys for 3 years. He had killed at least 28 of them, possibly more. Because the records were imperfect and the investigation was complicated by the fact that many of his victims were runaways from impoverished families in the Houston Heights neighborhood, boys whose disappearances had been reported, acknowledged, and quietly set aside, boys who the system had, in some fundamental way, already decided were not worth the same urgency as other missing children. Dean Corll grew up in Indiana and Texas, raised primarily by his mother, who ran a candy company. He was quiet, somewhat odd, not particularly memorable in school. He served in the army, worked at the family candy business, and by the late 1960s had established himself as a friendly fixture in the Houston Heights area, a man who gave free candy to neighborhood kids, who threw parties for teenagers, who was known to the local boys as a generous and approachable adult in a neighborhood where adult generosity was not always available. He drove them places. He bought them beer. He gave them money. In the Heights, in 1970, Dean Corll was not a red flag. He was a resource. The mechanism by which he operated is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. Corll recruited two teenage boys, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to procure victims for him. He paid them $200 per victim. He gave them the social currency of a car, of cash, of belonging, in exchange for an act that both boys would later claim they only gradually understood the full horror of. They would lure other boys to Corll's house with promises of a party, of alcohol, of a good time. Once there, the victims were restrained, tortured over periods of hours or sometimes days, and then killed. Corll had constructed a torture board, a sheet of plywood, with handcuffs attached in his house. He had a boat shed, where he committed many of the murders. He disposed of bodies across multiple sites, a boat shed he rented in southwest Houston, a beach on the Gulf Coast, a remote woodland area in Sam Rayburn. The scale of what was happening in the Heights was invisible for 3 years. This requires explanation, because it is perhaps the most important and the most uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. It was invisible, not because it was hidden perfectly, but because the victims were largely invisible to begin with. The Houston Heights was a working-class neighborhood. Many of the boys Corll targeted came from unstable homes, had histories of running away, had already been failed by schools and social services and sometimes their own families. When they disappeared, the police received reports, and those reports, in many cases, resulted in the standard notation for a teenage runaway and not much else. Some of the victims' parents were told, essentially, that their son had probably just moved on. Some were told to come back if he didn't turn up in a few weeks. Some were not told much at all. Meanwhile, Corll continued. He moved, he changed locations. He worked his way through the social network of the neighborhood with patience and method, always maintaining the persona of the friendly, generous man with the van and the candy and the parties. Henley and Brooks continued to bring him boys. David Brooks brought him his own friends. Elmer Wayne Henley brought him people he knew from school. There is no comfortable way to reckon with the fact that two teenage boys were complicit in the torture and murder of their peers. Both have given extensive interviews over the decades. Both describe a gradual entrapment, a combination of manipulation and fear, and a kind of moral numbness that descended over time. Whether this explanation is sufficient is a question that the families of the victims have never been able to answer in a way that brings them peace. And perhaps they never will. The night that ended it all was the night of August 8, 1973. Henley had brought a girl and another boy to Corll's house. This was a violation of Corll's rules, no girls. Corll was furious. He restrained all three of them, including Henley, using the torture board. At some point during the night, Corll released Henley as a gesture of trust, or dominance, or some combination of the two. Henley got to a gun. He stood over Dean Corll, and he pulled the trigger. He said later that he did it because he had reached the end of something. He didn't elaborate further. Some things don't elaborate. What followed the arrest of Henley and Brooks was a search operation that lasted months and uncovered 28 bodies. The actual number of Corll's victims may be higher. Henley has suggested a number closer to 30 or more, and several cases remain unresolved. The identification of all the victims took years. Some were identified through dental records, some through personal effects, some were only identified decades later through DNA analysis. The Houston Police Department faced severe criticism after the case was fully understood. The sheer number of missing person reports that had been filed and essentially ignored was not deniable. A city had lost at least 28 boys over 3 years, and the machinery designed to protect them had not worked. The department made changes. Whether those changes were sufficient is a debate that continues in Houston to this day. Dean Corll never stood trial. He was dead at 33, shot on his own floor by a boy he had turned into something he could use. Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks were both convicted of multiple counts of murder. Henley was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year terms. Brooks was sentenced to life. Both remain incarcerated. Henley has been denied parole numerous times and has given extensive interviews in which he expresses what he describes as genuine remorse, and in which he continues to argue that he was as much a victim of Corll as anyone. The families of the boys he helped deliver to that house have never accepted this framing. They are not required to. The Heights neighborhood of Houston has changed enormously since 1973. The streets where these boys lived and were recruited and disappeared have been gentrified, developed, transformed. But if you talk to the people who grew up there in that era, the ones who are still alive, the ones who remember, they will tell you that certain summers still feel heavy in a way they can't quite explain. That the names come back sometimes. That there are boys from those streets who never got to grow up, whose names are on a list that the city spent a long time pretending didn't exist. Their names are on that list. They deserve to be remembered. In 2018, the FBI made an announcement that barely registered in the mainstream news cycle. It was a single sentence in a press release, the kind of thing that gets 30 seconds on the evening news and then disappears. But for the investigators who had spent years working on cold cases across the United States, it was like a bomb going off in slow motion. The FBI announced that a 78-year-old man named Samuel Little was likely the most prolific serial killer in American history, with investigators having confirmed his responsibility for 93 murders spanning more than 3 decades and at least 19 states. 93 murders, more than Ted Bundy, more than John Wayne Gacy, more than virtually any other killer in the recorded history of this country, and most Americans had never heard his name. The reason most Americans had never heard of Samuel Little is also, in a terrible and important way, the reason he was able to keep killing for as long as he did. His victims were almost exclusively women who existed on the margins of society. Sex workers, drug addicts, homeless women, women with criminal records, women from impoverished communities, many of them black, women whose disappearances generated minimal police response. Women who, when their bodies were found, were frequently logged not as homicide victims, but as drug overdoses, as accidents, as deaths from natural causes. Women who the system had already decided were not worth the full weight of its attention. Samuel Little understood this. He did not stumble upon it by accident. He selected his victims with what investigators would later conclude was a sophisticated, calculating awareness of who could disappear and not be looked for too hard. Samuel Little was born in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, and spent most of his childhood being raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. He had an extensive criminal record, beginning in the 1950s: robbery, assault, fraud, attempted rape. He was arrested over 100 times during his lifetime. He served multiple prison sentences. He was a drifter, moving between cities, between states, never settling, never establishing the kind of fixed life that would have made him easy to track. He drove. He walked. He took buses. He moved through the country like something that leaves no fixed address, no tax records, no lease, no trace. He killed by strangulation with his bare hands. He was an exceptionally strong man. He had boxed competitively in his youth and maintained a physical power that was out of proportion to his age well into his later decades. He targeted women he encountered in bars, on streets, in the neighborhoods he passed through. He would offer them money or drugs. He would take them somewhere private, and then he would use his hands. He was methodical. He was controlled. He said later, in the interviews that would make investigators' blood run cold, that he enjoyed what he called the going-to-sleep look in their eyes. He said it with an equanimity that made clear he had thought about it many times and had long since made peace with whatever it made him. For 35 years, Samuel Little killed and walked away. He was arrested twice for murder during that period, once in 1982 in Mississippi and once in 1984 in Florida, and was acquitted both times. The evidence in those cases was thin. The victims were women who attracted little sympathy from juries, and Little was articulate and composed on the stand. He walked. He kept walking. He kept killing. What finally stopped him was not a brilliant piece of detective work, not a task force, not an informant. What stopped Samuel Little was a DNA database. In 2012, he was arrested in Louisville, Kentucky on a drug charge and extradited to Los Angeles on unrelated assault charges. A routine DNA swab taken as part of that process matched him to 3 cold case murders from the 1980s in Los Angeles. He was convicted in 2014 and sentenced to 3 life terms. He was 74 years old. The investigators who began interviewing him after his conviction in California could not have anticipated what was about to happen. Little, confined to a wheelchair by this point and aware that he would die in prison, began to talk. He talked at extraordinary length and in extraordinary detail. He gave names, some names, though not all. He gave locations, he gave descriptions, he gave the years. And across the country, in field offices and county sheriff departments and small-town police stations, investigators began pulling cold case files and cross-referencing what he was saying against deaths that had been listed as accidental or undetermined for decades. 93 confirmed matches. The FBI believes the actual number of his victims may be higher, but Little died in December of 2020, at 80 years old, having confirmed 93. There are an unknown number of additional cases that he described, but that have not been conclusively matched to an unresolved death. The FBI has a dedicated webpage where they post Little's hand-drawn portraits of his victims. He drew them from memory, in his prison cell, in vivid and specific detail, in the hope that someone, somewhere, will recognize a face. Some have been identified this way. Many have not. There is a woman Little called the Marilyn Monroe of the group. He remembered her clearly. He drew her portrait. She has not been identified. There is a woman he placed in a specific city, in a specific year, whose name he did not know. She has not been identified. There are names attached to women whose bodies have never been found. There are bodies found in fields and under bridges and in drainage ditches across 19 states that may or may not belong to Samuel Little's list and may never be confirmed either way. The most chilling thing about the Samuel Little case, the detail that I keep coming back to, that I think matters most as a statement about how this country handled, or failed to handle, the disappearances of certain kinds of women, is not the number 93. It is that he operated for 35 years, was arrested twice for murder and acquitted twice, and during that time the women he killed were categorized as overdoses and accidents and unknowns. The system looked at those deaths and again, found a way to see something other than what they were. Samuel Little was not invisible. His victims were made invisible. And that distinction is not a footnote, it is the story. There is a detail about Gary Ridgway that his interrogators say they have never been able to fully shake, even years after the case was closed. It is not the number of his victims, though that number 49 confirmed, with Ridgway himself claiming as many as 80, is staggering. It is not the duration of his killing, which spanned nearly 2 decades. It is this. Gary Ridgway was interviewed by detectives in 1984, 2 years after the killings began. He was interviewed again in 1987. He passed a polygraph in 1984. He was given a saliva test in 1987 that was inconclusive with the forensic technology of the time. And then he was released both times, and he went home, and he went to work the next morning at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he had been painting trucks since 1969. He married. He attended church. He went door to door for church activities in his neighborhood. He read the Bible. He prayed. And on weekends, sometimes, he drove along Pacific Highway South, and he killed women. Gary Ridgway grew up in the Salt Lake City area and moved to the Pacific Northwest as a young man. By his own account, his childhood was shaped by a domineering mother whom he both feared and fixated on, in ways he has described obliquely, and that psychiatrists have spent decades trying to fully parse. He joined the Navy, served in Vietnam, returned, married, divorced, married again, divorced again, married a third time, to a woman named Judith, who by all external accounts had absolutely no idea what her husband was doing, and whose devastation upon learning the truth was described by people who knew her as total and permanent. His primary hunting ground was the stretch of Pacific Highway South, running through the SeaTac area of Washington, a corridor of motels, truck stops, and street walking, that, in the early 1980s, was well known to law enforcement as an area where vulnerable women, many of them sex workers, many of them runaways, many of them teenagers, were concentrated. Ridgway would approach them in his truck. He would negotiate, pay, drive them to a secluded location, have sex with them, and then strangle them. He was often calm enough afterward to return to the site with food and eat near the body. He posed bodies in degrading positions, sometimes returning to them after death. He scattered remains across a wide geographic area, some in clusters he called his trash pits, to confuse investigators about the scope of his operation. The Green River Task Force was established in 1982 after a series of bodies were found in and near the Green River south of Seattle. At its peak, it had more than 50 detectives assigned to it and was considered one of the largest task force investigations in American history. It generated over 10,000 suspects. It interviewed thousands of people. It used a computer database for investigative leads at a time when that was genuinely cutting-edge police technology. It deployed a team that included forensic psychologists, geographic profilers, and consultants, including, notoriously, serial killer Ted Bundy, who was on death row at the time, and offered to help investigators understand the Green River killer's psychology. Bundy's insights, such as they were, did not identify Ridgway. For 20 years, the task force could not close the case. Women kept disappearing. Bodies kept turning up, in the woods, in the river, under piles of leaves and dirt on the hillsides outside Seattle. And Gary Ridgway kept going to work, and painting trucks, and attending church. Several times he was in the same room as investigators. Several times, investigators came close. Each time, something: insufficient technology, misdirection, the sheer volume of suspects let him walk. What finally ended it was DNA. In 2001, advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to retest biological evidence collected from several victims in the 1980s. The DNA matched Gary Ridgway. He was arrested on November 30th, 2001, pulled over in his truck on his way to work. He was 52 years old. He had last killed in 1998. What followed the arrest was one of the most extensive, and in some ways most ethically fraught, plea negotiations in the history of American criminal law. Ridgway offered investigators something they desperately needed: the locations of victims who had never been found. In exchange for his life, in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table, he would help investigators recover remains and close cases that families had been living inside for 20 years. The King County prosecutors agreed. They have defended that decision. The families of the victims have been divided about it ever since, and that division is completely understandable, because it requires balancing two things that should not have to be balanced: the closure of knowing where your daughter is, and the satisfaction of watching the man who killed her die for it. Over the course of his cooperation, Ridgway led investigators to remains that had not been found in 2 decades of searching. He described victims in detail. He described his methods with a detachment that investigators found deeply disturbing, not because he was emotional, but because he was not. He described killing with the same flat affect he might use to describe a long commute. He said at one point that he had killed so many women he had trouble keeping track. He said he had chosen sex workers because he knew they would not be missed as quickly. He said he killed because he hated them. He said he killed because he did not want to pay them. He gave multiple explanations that contradicted each other, and investigators have since concluded that the true motivation may be something Ridgway himself is not capable of fully articulating. He was sentenced to life without parole on 49 counts of aggravated murder. He is currently incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He is in his mid-70s. He continues to be interviewed periodically by investigators working on cold cases. He answers questions. He provides information. Whether he provides all the information he has is something that will probably never be known for certain. The Green River case is frequently cited in forensic science and criminal justice circles as a landmark for the use of DNA evidence to close long-term cold cases. The task force's records: 10,000 suspects, thousands of interviews, 2 decades of accumulated investigative material have become a teaching resource. The case appears in textbooks. It is discussed in classrooms. What does not appear in the textbooks, or not prominently enough, is this: most of the women Gary Ridgway killed were sex workers or runaways. And the pace of the investigation was materially affected by the fact that the victims were not considered, by some in law enforcement and in the wider public, to be the same kind of victims as women with stable homes and steady jobs and concerned families who called every day. Some of the victims' families were treated, during the investigation, as secondary concerns. Some were not properly notified when remains were found. A detective named Dave Reichert, who led the task force for much of its existence and later became a congressman, has spoken about this disparity with what seems like genuine regret. The women deserve to be named. They deserve to be more than a number on a list attached to a case that made Gary Ridgway famous. Their names were Wendy Lee Caulfield, Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Cynthia Jean Hinz, Opal Charmaine Mills, and 44 others. They had families, they had histories, they had whole lives that ended on a stretch of highway south of Seattle, in the truck of a man who went to church on Sundays and has never, not once, expressed anything that anyone who has sat across from him has been able to identify as genuine remorse. There's a particular kind of horror in a case where the killer has thought so far ahead, has constructed such a complete architecture of concealment, that the crimes themselves begin to feel almost theatrical in their deliberateness. Robert Hansen did not kill in the grip of uncontrolled compulsion, the way some killers describe their crimes. Robert Hansen planned. Robert Hansen prepared. Robert Hansen had a small Piper Super Cub aircraft, a detailed topographical map of the Alaskan wilderness south of Anchorage, and a method so specific and so calculated that when investigators finally understood what he had been doing for 12 years, several of them described the moment of comprehension as physically nauseating. He would abduct a woman, almost always a sex worker or a dancer from one of Anchorage's strip clubs. Almost always someone whose disappearance would be attributed to the transient nature of that world and not to foul play. He would restrain her, hold her for a period of time, and then fly her to a remote location in the wilderness south of the city. He would release her, and then he would hunt her. He was an avid big game hunter who had set world records in archery hunting and had amassed a trophy room of extraordinary scope. He hunted bear and Dall sheep and caribou in the Alaskan backcountry with a precision and a patience that had made him locally famous among hunters. He applied the same skill set, the same patience, the same relationship to terrain, to the murders of at least 17 women and possibly as many as 21 over a 12-year period. He marked their burial sites on his map with small X's. He kept the map hidden in the attic of the house he shared with his wife and 2 children in a quiet Anchorage suburb. Robert Hansen grew up in Pocahontas, Iowa, the son of a strict Danish immigrant father who ran a bakery. He was bullied relentlessly as a child and teenager. He had a severe stutter and debilitating acne that left significant scarring, and developed an outsized bitterness toward women, particularly women who he felt had rejected or humiliated him. He enlisted in the army, married, cheated, was caught, divorced. He committed arson in Iowa and was sentenced to time in a psychiatric facility. He moved to Alaska in 1967 with a new wife, who knew nothing of his history, and within a few years had established himself as a beloved community figure, a family man, a baker who ran a popular shop, a champion archer who was generous with hunting advice and gear. The early disappearances did not generate significant alarm. This was Alaska, in the 1970s, a state with a frontier culture that had its own complicated relationship to missing persons, particularly missing women from the sex industry, who in the context of that era and that place, were considered by many in law enforcement to be mobile, transient, and likely to have simply moved on. Some of Hansen's victims had no one to report them missing. Some were reported missing, and the reports went nowhere. The map in his attic filled up slowly, one X at a time, across years in which no one connected the disappearances. The break in the case came in 1983, when a 17-year-old woman named Cindy Paulson escaped. She had been abducted, restrained in Hansen's home, and was being transported when she managed to escape at a truck stop on 6th Avenue in Anchorage, still in handcuffs, and flagged down a passing motorist. She went directly to the police and told them everything: the name Robert Hansen, the address, the plane, all of it. And then something happened that has since become one of the most studied failures of this investigation. The Anchorage police spoke to Hansen, who presented himself as a calm, respected community member, produced an alibi from friends who said he had been with them that evening, and told investigators that Cindy was a sex worker with a grudge. The police accepted this. They did not arrest him. Cindy Paulson was not believed. Cindy Paulson remained consistent. She told her story to anyone who would listen. She was consistent in every detail. And for several months, investigators continued to treat Robert Hansen as a credible alibi haver and Cindy as an unreliable witness. The precise reasons for this, whether it was simple laziness, whether it was the bias against sex workers that has infected law enforcement in case after case, whether it was the social standing Hansen had built over 15 years in Anchorage, have been debated since. What is not debated is that it was wrong. What eventually forced investigators to take another look was a conversation between an Alaska State Trooper named Glenn Floth and an FBI profiler. Floth had been quietly accumulating missing persons reports from the Anchorage area and began to see a pattern: young women, most of them in the sex industry, disappearing over a span of years. He requested a psychological profile. The profiler described a subject who was likely a hunter, likely physically unimposing, and socially marginalized in his past, likely a respected community figure with a secret life. Floth thought of Hansen immediately. He went to his superiors. He pushed. He was persistent in a way that made people uncomfortable. And eventually, he got a search warrant. The search of Hansen's property recovered the map, the hunting knife, and a trove of jewelry and personal items that were identified as belonging to missing women. It also recovered the Piper Super Cub aircraft, which, when examined, showed evidence consistent with its described use. Hansen was confronted with the evidence. He confessed. He led investigators to burial sites across the wilderness south of Anchorage, locations so remote that some required float plane access, locations where women's remains had been lying undiscovered for years, while the man who put them there baked pastries and sold hunting equipment and coached his son's Little League team. Hansen was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder as part of a plea agreement under which he agreed to cooperate with investigators and disclose all burial sites in exchange for being allowed to serve his time in an Alaskan facility rather than a federal prison. He was sentenced to life plus 461 years without the possibility of parole. 17 victims were confirmed. Investigators believe the actual number is higher. Several sites on his map yielded no remains, either because the remains had decomposed completely in the harsh Alaskan terrain or because Hansen's map was not complete. Robert Hansen died in prison in 2014 at the age of 75. He never expressed what anyone who knew him considered to be real remorse. He continued to frame himself, in the limited interviews he gave over his remaining years, as a man who had been pushed past a breaking point by a lifetime of rejection. He spoke about his childhood. He spoke about the bullying. Investigators who spent time with him said that he seemed to believe this framing was exculpatory, that the misery of his early life was a kind of explanation that should soften what came after. It does not. Cindy Paulson, the woman who escaped, who was not believed, who told the truth from the beginning and was dismissed, has spoken publicly about her experience. She said that the hardest part was not the abduction. The hardest part was walking into a police station and being treated like a liar. She said, "I knew what he had done. I knew there were other women out there. And nobody would listen to me." That is the part of this case that should never be forgotten. A 17-year-old girl escaped Robert Hansen and told the truth. And for months, the truth was not enough. There are serial killers who are caught because they make mistakes. There are serial killers who are caught because someone escapes, or because a witness comes forward, or because technology advances far enough to match them to something they left behind. And then there are killers who are essentially impossible to catch using any of the conventional methods investigators have spent generations refining, and Israel Keyes was one of those killers. He was caught entirely by accident, and only because he made one decision, at the end of a killing career spanning more than a decade, that introduced a variable he had not planned for. That variable was a debit card. Israel Keyes is considered by the FBI to be one of the most sophisticated and organized killers they have ever investigated. That assessment comes not from the men and women who studied him at a distance after his death, but from the agents who sat across from him during 36 hours of recorded interviews in 2000 and 12 interviews during which Keyes described his methods, his planning, his philosophy, and some of his crimes with a calm, analytical precision that made multiple experienced investigators say, afterward, that it was unlike anything they had experienced. He was not bragging. He was not performing. He was explaining, with the matter-of-fact clarity of a man describing a complicated technical process, how he had managed to commit multiple murders across the continental United States for over a decade without ever being connected to any of them. Israel Keyes was born in 1978 in Utah and raised largely in rural Washington and Oregon by fundamentalist Christian parents who were part of an isolationist movement and who homeschooled their children. He had 10 siblings. He enlisted in the Army at 18, served 3 years, was by all accounts a disciplined and capable soldier, and was discharged with no criminal record. He moved to Alaska first to Anchorage, then to a more remote area, and established himself as a contractor, running a small construction business. He had a daughter with a girlfriend. He was present in his community, in a low-key functional way that left virtually no impression on anyone who encountered him. What he was doing, in parallel with the life everyone could see, was planning and executing murders. Not the spontaneous, opportunity-driven murders of many serial killers. Systematic, pre-planned, geographically dispersed murders designed from the beginning to be impossible to connect to each other or to him. He would fly from Alaska to a distant city, Texas, Chicago, New York, Vermont, rent a car with cash, drive to a location he had scouted in advance, sometimes years in advance, use equipment he had buried at the site during a previous visit in so-called murder kits, commit the crime, drive back, fly home. He would not use his phone near the crime. He would not use his real name. He would not establish any connection between himself in Alaska and himself in whatever city he was operating in. He specifically avoided killing in Alaska or anywhere near his home. He had buried murder kits across the country, prepositioned supplies, weapons, and materials at remote locations, sometimes years before he intended to use them. This level of premeditation caching equipment at a site years in advance is something FBI investigators say they have not encountered in any other documented case. It suggests not impulsive violence, but methodical, long-horizon planning of the kind more commonly associated with military operations or organized crime than with what investigators think of when they think of serial murder. He had rules. He told investigators about some of them. He did not kill in winter because snow preserved evidence. He did not kill close to home. He did not kill people connected to him. He did not repeat methods or locations in ways that would create a pattern. He deliberately varied everything: the type of victim, the geographic location, the method to prevent investigators from identifying a signature that could be connected across jurisdictions. He understood, in a sophisticated way, that the sharing of information between police departments in different states was imperfect, and that a murder in Texas and a murder in Vermont would almost certainly never be connected to a single perpetrator unless that perpetrator left a consistent signature. So, he left none. For over a decade, it worked. The FBI has confirmed 11 of his victims. Keyes himself suggested the number was higher and hinted at crimes they had not found. He was coy about the precise number in ways that investigators believe were partly about control, maintaining something they could not fully take from him even after his arrest. The confirmed victims are spread across Alaska, Texas, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Washington State, and potentially other states still being investigated. The crime that caught him was the murder of 18-year-old Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska, in February of 2012. Koenig was working alone at a coffee stand when Keyes approached and abducted her. This was, by his own later admission, a deviation from his rules. He killed close to home. He took someone who would be immediately missed, and he needed money, which introduced the variable that ended his freedom. After killing her, he used her debit card to withdraw cash. The card was tracked. Surveillance footage showed him at an ATM in Arizona. He was stopped by police in Lufkin, Texas, on March 13, 2012, a routine traffic stop that became something else when investigators connected the debit card to the vehicle. What followed was extraordinary. Keyes did not deny his crimes. He engaged. He seemed, to the FBI agents who interviewed him, almost relieved to have someone to talk to about what he had done, not in the confessional way, not in the way of a man seeking absolution, but in the way of a craftsman who had spent years working alone and now finally had an audience who could understand the level of the craft. He described his methods. He described his planning philosophy. He talked about burial sites and cached equipment. He gave investigators enough to confirm multiple crimes and enough to understand, with growing horror, the full architecture of what he had constructed. He negotiated. He would give them more information, more victims, more locations in exchange for conditions around his death sentence. He wanted assurances about the treatment of his daughter. He wanted control over the narrative. He wanted to decide what was released and when. Investigators were in the almost impossible position of needing what he knew badly enough to have a conversation with a man who was using the locations of his victims' remains as a bargaining chip. On December 2, 2012, before those negotiations reached any final resolution, Israel Keyes was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had cut his wrists and strangled himself with a piece of bedsheet. He was 34 years old. He left a handwritten note that was largely a poem about death and darkness, and that investigators have analyzed extensively without reaching consensus on what it communicates beyond the obvious. He died with information that he had not yet given up. There are cases still open. There are sites still unlocated. There is a number, the real number of his victims, that has never been confirmed and may never be. The FBI continues to investigate Israel Keyes. His case is considered active. They have a tip line. They have publicized his travel records and asked anyone who encountered him in specific locations during specific years to come forward. Some people have. Whether the complete picture will ever be assembled is uncertain. What is certain is this: for over a decade, a methodical, disciplined, deeply intelligent man moved through the United States, leaving people dead and leaving nothing else. He planned it that way from the beginning. He designed a system for killing that was built to outlast any investigation. The only reason we know his name is a debit card. The only reason he was stopped is that he broke his own rules once and used cash in a way that left a trace. If he had been more careful on that one occasion, if he had stuck to his system on the night he chose to deviate from it, Israel Keys might still be adding to a number that nobody would ever know was a number. That is not a comfortable thought to end on, but it is the true one.